You know what you must do.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. George R. Martin just ripped HBO and House of the Dragon. He posted a very heated blog post complaining about several changes on House of the Dragon the show has made and how those changes would negatively affect the Season 3 and Season 4 plot. He referred to them as the butterfly effect and toxic butterflies, like there are more changes that they have discussed that will cause even bigger ripple effects in eventual Season 4. The reason why he goes as far ahead as Season 4 is because they previously announced that would be the final season of the show. So basically, George R. Martin outlined all these grievances he had against the show and how they'll affect the rest of the show. It's very lengthy. He brought the receipts, like he gets into gritty detail on a lot of things, so we'll break it all down. And some of them are pretty spoilery, which is why I think he probably deleted the post right after he made it. We'll get into that too, because he posted this really long diatribe about all of his grievances, then within a couple hours of that, just completely deleted the post. Very epic tweeting and deleting on his part. Some of the things that he addresses, I've actually already discussed in my previous Season 2 and Season 3 videos recently because we've known about some of the changes they made and how they will probably affect the future of the story. If you're brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to get all the episodes. Whatever they do wind up doing, I will do videos for Season 3, Season 4. I also just did a trailer video for Night of the Seven Kingdoms. That's coming out next year. Those are the episodes we'll be getting next year. Interestingly enough, he has not griped about Night of the Seven Kingdoms. He's actually spoken very highly of that upcoming series in his previous posts. He sounds like he's pretty excited for that. So we should preface this whole post of his by saying that even though he totally does rip House of the Dragon and the writers a new one, mostly the showrunner, mostly he's mad about him, George R. Martin has spoken very highly of the show in the past, and he does, in general, he does like the show. It's just some of the specific changes that he's really pissed off about.
Well, funny you should ask. Let me get my map.
There have been a couple times where he said specifically that the way they've changed the characters on the show have made those characters better than they are in his books. So there have been times in the past where he said the show version has been better than his version, but not in the case of this blog post. Like some of the things he talks about are things that are vastly different. The ironic thing about that is that one of the characters that he said was better on the show than in his book version is tied up as a big part of this major gripe that he has against the show. Just starting with the biggest stuff he was complaining about, like at the beginning of his post, he mentioned multiple changes but only spoke about a few of them in very great detail. But based on what the show has done with everybody so far up to this point, I think we have some idea of what he was talking about. He starts with the events of Blood and Cheese and how the show has gotten rid of Aegon and Helena's third child, Maelor. This is where he starts to get into his butterfly effect and how removing Maelor from the show is one example of how the future story will be negatively affected and it will cause bigger ripple effects in the story. On the show, the Blood and Cheese event was changed a lot. They implied that Daemon was the one who told them that it should be a son for son and bring them ahead of a son no matter what. They couldn't find Aemond, who was in Flea Bottom getting some of his naked mommy therapy at the brothel. And because they were ordered it should be a son for son, they went for the nearest son they could find in Helena's room. They order her to tell them which child is Jaehaerys because they both have long hair, they look identical. She winds up giving up Jaehaerys, who they kill and get caught by the Kingsguard and the Gold Cloaks while trying to escape with his head. In the books, they say Daemon told Mysaria to hire Blood and Cheese, and she's the one who conducts the transaction and gives them the orders that it should be a son for a son. So they put way more of this on Mysaria than they put on Daemon on the show. There was no mention of Aemond being the intended target in the books, just that it was a son for a son. It could be any son at all. They eventually happened upon Helaena, who had 3 children in the books, 2 of them boys, Jaehaerys, the older one, who was Aegon's heir apparent, and Maelor, the youngest son. They order Helaena to pick which one they'll kill because it's meant to be random. They don't care which son it is, it just needs to be a son for a son. Helaena picks Maelor because he's further down the line of succession, and if Jaehaerys survives, Aegon will still have his heir. But they detect her trick and kill Jaehaerys instead. Then the rest goes down pretty much the way it went down on the show. George R. Martin was furious that the show got rid of Maelor completely, like he thought they were delaying his arrival on the show. Then he says he learned eventually they would not do the character at all, and that's when he really started to get mad. All because of the serious butterfly effects that Maelor's absence would negatively impact the rest of the story. He said when Ryan Condal, the showrunner, informed him that they were going to change the scene when they were writing season 2 back in 2022, like long before they ever filmed it, he said he argued against the change because he felt like it weakened the blood and cheese scene. It's way more hardcore in the books. If it wasn't clear, George R. R. Martin has written a lot on House of the Dragon. He's been much more involved creatively in crafting the show and the story than he was on the original Game of Thrones show. I think that was partly because of the backlash for Game of Thrones Season 8. HBO probably brought him in as a creative force in a bigger way than he was involved in the original show, hoping that that would help things. Also because House of the Dragon doesn't nearly have as much material to adapt directly as the original show did. Like, there's only a small amount of book material that House of the Dragon is able to cover, so they have to write in a lot of new story for all these characters. So far, George R. R. Martin has been working with them every step of the way on that. As he says, he hasn't always agreed with some of the changes that they've made in service of that. He goes on to say that he still loves the Blood and Cheese episode overall. Like, he actually likes the show. He loved the episode. He just really hated that they cut the Maelor character and how that's going to negatively impact the future of the story in his eyes. Because Maelor not being on the show means that he's not involved in any of the future events that he was part of in the books, and he's involved in some very big events and becomes motivation for some very big things happening later on, which will all have to change now that he isn't around. This is where George R. R. Martin gets into very specific, very nitty-gritty moments from the future of the story. So he says Maelor's eventual death later in the story becomes part of the motivation for Helaena to eventually kill herself, which is obviously a huge moment. Because he's not around, they'll have to completely change the motivation for her death. Like during season 2, most of us thought that they were implying that Aemond was threatening to kill Helaena, and maybe he be the reason that she died. Like, she wouldn't try to kill herself, it would actually be Aemond killing her, or someone else killing her. It'd be a huge, huge change from the books. And originally in the books, the way that Helaena dies, the reason why she dies, becomes a big tipping point for King's Landing turning against Rhaenyra, who was ruling over King's Landing at the time, having captured the city with Daemon's help, which we know is going to happen at the beginning of Season 3. Already you can start to see some of the big changes. I talked about this during my Season 2 finale video. Rhaenyra spoke of Helaena as if she was this gentle soul and wanted nothing bad to happen to her at all. Like, they're completely changing that whole dynamic between all of them. In the books, the way that Helaena dies, the reason why she dies, eventually leads to major riots, and George R. R. Martin specifically mentions some other very spoilery moments that the small folk get up to in the story, so I don't want to get too deep into that, just because it is crazy spoilery. But the story is done that they're adapting. Like, you can go out and read it right now if you want to read ahead. You don't want to wait for Season 3 and Season 4. But the idea is that the small folk blame Rhaenyra for Helena's death and begin to write crazy around King's Landing. Like, it's really bad. Probably the best way to dodge spoilers here is to say the small folk eventually destroy the thing that is most precious to all Targaryens. Then this leads the small folk to support Aegon over Rhaenyra, and it helps lead to Rhaenyra's eventual death, why that winds up happening in the story further on. So the idea is that Maelor becomes the big tipping point for a lot of these huge, bigger moments later on in the story, onto the final season. George R. R. Martin is pissed that they got rid of Maelor because of those big moments he's involved in and how they're going to change those other future moments. Like, what is going to be the motivation for Helena's death now? What is going to be the motivation for Rhaenyra's eventual death? Which he calls toxic butterflies, as in the toxic butterfly effect on the future of the show. I'm leaving out a ton of very specific spoilery things that George R. R. Martin said because he does get into like very big spoilery moments from the future of the story. But I covered all the broad strokes of his grievances and like the major parts. The big difference is that he points out specific passages in the future of the story in the books. So I try to cover all those in as broad a strokes as possible, in as non-spoilery way as possible. I did do a big House of the Dragon Season 3 video a little while ago where I talked about some of the changes the show has already made, like giving Nettle's storyline to Rhaena where she claims Sheep Stealer and how that's going to affect the future of the story. I discussed some of the other changes at the end of Season 2 that are going to affect the plot during Season 3, Season 4, so I'll link that at the end of this. This is the way George R. R. Martin ended his blog post. So he said, there are larger and more toxic butterflies to come if House of the Dragon goes ahead with some of the changes being contemplated for Season 3 and Season 4, then ending with his typical blog post signature, GRRM. The changes he's probably talking about are in how Rhaenyra dies, why she dies, like the motivation for the Shepherd leading riots in King's Landing and what they get up to, and generally how the show ends, like how the other major characters either eventually die or survive and what happens to the characters that do survive. One of the things I'm pretty sure that they're going to change on the show is that they'll end the show, like season 4 will be the final season, so they'll wind up ending the show within at least like one episode of Rhaenyra's death. Like the show isn't going to go that far past Rhaenyra's death. All because the show has been turning around Rhaenyra and Alicent, and they really want you to think that Rhaenyra is the actual main character of the show. The Fire and Blood book that they're adapting for this actually goes well past the events of Rhaenyra's death. They explain what happens to everyone for many years after that, the future of Rhaenyra's children, Aegon III, Viserys II. On the show, they're very small. Really good example of George R. R. Martin's toxic butterfly effect, like causing bigger changes in the future of the story. Ryan Condal, the showrunner, the person that George R. R. Martin puts on blast in his blog post, has already said that they won't be doing any more time jumps on the show, meaning that the characters that you see are going to be the ages that they are through the end of the show. Notice that Aegon and Viserys are tiny babies, like they're not going to get any bigger. Aegon's dragon Stormcloud, who is a tiny dragon, very cute, is not going to get any bigger on the show. And coming up in Season 3 is the Battle of the Gullet. Aegon and Stormcloud, for example, play a big role during that battle. They won't really be able to do now because they're so small. That's going to be the sea battle against the Triarchy's fleet. We saw them sailing to Westeros at the end of Season 2. There are a lot of WTF things that happened during that battle. Many of the major characters are involved. Nettles was also a big part of the Battle of the Gullet, meaning that now she will not be part of it. It'll be Rhaena instead, causing further changes. Without getting into too specific spoilers or anything like that, there are many WTF deaths that happen during that big battle. Like, it's going to be a crazy big battle. But you can see how that's going to play out very differently now because of the changes that they previously made on the show. Probably the biggest change that George R. R. Martin is referring to when he's talking about toxic butterflies, I think, will be how and why Rhaenyra winds up dying. What the show writes that into the story, what sequence of events causes it, the things that happen in King's Landing that help lead to that. There's some very big changes that he doesn't really discuss, like, for instance, the whole relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra, like the very personal relationship, making them seem way closer than they were in the books. He doesn't really talk about any of that. And weirdly, he did not complain at all about Daemon spending all season at Harrenhal getting his weirwood therapy from the Three-Eyed Raven and Alice Rivers. You'd think that he would complain about that a little bit. Maybe because it was such a big opportunity to actually do Harrenhal on the show in live action in a way that they haven't done previously. Like, the way they do Harrenhal is way more detailed, way deeper than they did on the original Game of Thrones show. I talked about this during my Season 2 episode videos too, but they also turned George R. R. Martin into the face of the weirwood at Harrenhal. You can actually see him visiting the set here. They literally carve his face into the tree. So when Daemon is touching the tree, seeing the Three-Eyed Raven, he's actually touching George R. R. Martin's face. It's like George R. R. Martin is giving him all the spoilers from the story. So like I said, he's been very complimentary about the show in the past, so it sounds like there are things that he likes about the show and a couple things that he really does not like about the show. Personally, I think he's fine to complain about stuff, like this is his material that they're trying to adapt, so if it's not adapted the way he wants it to be adapted, you would expect him to not be happy about it. The weirder thing, though, is that like a couple hours after he posted his big blog of grievances, he actually deleted his post. So people are like, wait a minute, why did he delete it? Did HBO threaten some kind of legal repercussions? I actually don't think that's the case. During his post, even though he does rip them a new one, he does say some very complimentary things about working with HBO, like he expects to continue working with them on future shows in the Game of Thrones universe. They're very deep into development on a bunch of different Game of Thrones sequels, prequels, spin-offs. There's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes that he's heavily involved in. And like I said, he said the show's version of Helaena is actually better than the book version of Helaena. Like, of all the characters they've changed, he's like, wow, you did an amazing version of Helaena, way better than I did in the books. So I don't think that HBO cares about the actual criticism. I think the reason why he pulled the post down is because of the very specific, very detailed spoilers that he gets into, which they'll probably cover in Season 3 and Season 4. Like, yes, there'll be changes, but some of the stuff that he mentions, they will probably eventually do. So early theory, if HBO did ask him to remove the post, it's mostly for spoilery reasons. Also because in the past, if you've been following George R. R. Martin's blog posts, he's complained about HBO and the original Game of Thrones series while the original series was still happening, and HBO did not care about that criticism. So I don't think they care about the criticism now. It's probably more about the specific spoilery Season 3 and Season 4 moments that they will adapt. And most of what he talks about, like most of the big spoilers, are probably going to be Season 4 things. Post all your reactions in the comments below. We can get deeper into the weeds inside the comments. And what I'll do, because he deleted his blog post, I'll put most of his blog posts, or as much as I can fit, in the description for this video so you can actually read what he actually wrote. YouTube has a limit on the length of how long you can actually make video descriptions, so I should be able to fit a bunch of it in there, but maybe not everything. There's a bunch of big stuff coming up. Like I said, I just did a big trailer video for Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. We'll probably get an even bigger one later this year. Click here for that, and click here for my House of the Dragon Season 3 video that gets into some of the changes that they made and how that's going to affect Season 3. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.